Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Corner Society. The spring session is back. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Michal Raz, and I co-coordinated together with Mr. Bob Riley, who, if he's not in the room, is busy doing important things all the time. Thank you. We are under the auspices of the Department of Health Humanities and Bioethics at the University of Rochester Medical Center. We meet here a few times a semester, usually once a month. And as I say at every meeting, I think we are the longest continuously running History of Medicine series that we know of in North America. You are welcome to submit a correction, but so far, nobody has. We're excited to welcome you to the spring series. We have set up a bunch of interesting lectures, and I will introduce our speaker today. So it's really exciting and gratifying to introduce and welcome our speaker tonight, which is Dr. Christine Slobogin. She is our newest colleague and an assistant professor at Health Humanities and Bioethics at the University of Rochester. She really arrived last month, and I managed to convince her to come give a talk. Thank you for agreeing. Dr. Slobogin is an art historian and a health humanities scholar, and she uses visual culture as a way to understand ethics, emotion, medicine, and gender in history. She has a commitment to making history of medicine accessible to a broader audience, and has done that through different mediums, most notably podcasting, which I understand she is going to bring that to our community as well. And I think we're all pretty excited about that. She is an accomplished and well-published scholar, but I'll just mention her first book, which is titled Plastic Surgery on Paper, How Visual Culture Defines Second World War Constructive Surgery in Britain, which is going to be published soon, I believe, with University of Rochester Press, so you can see a lot of local connections. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Slobogin to the stage. Please join me in welcoming her. She will present part of her work project. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you to Michal for inviting me to speak today to the Corner Society. As I only arrived in Rochester at the beginning of this year, this feels like a great welcome to the history of medicine community here. And I'm grateful for the chance to get to share some elements of my research with you all. Just for some context of who I am and what I do, as Michal mentioned, I trained as an art historian, but I've pretty much always, even since my undergraduate days, really, I've always done art history within the history of medicine. I therefore dubbed myself an art historian of medicine, since I'm most interested in looking at how visual and material culture shapes medical understanding and medical practice historically. So throughout my work, I ask two main questions, among many others, but how have images been used to define, describe, and teach medicine? And what are the social, experiential, and emotional impacts of those images, both in their historical period and today? So what I'm going to present to you this evening is a case study that sits within those larger questions that underpin all of my work. And I hope that these questions and this presentation will spark some interest in you all. And I hope that we can continue to discuss medicine, visual and material culture, and art in my years to come here in Rochester. So I'll be using some art historical methods and photographic theory in this talk. So please do feel free to ask questions about that, about those approaches during the Q&A, as I know this might be just a little bit different from more typical topics or methods that are presented here at the Corner Society. So this presentation comes from my larger book project, which Michal mentioned already. Luckily, the title hasn't changed, so that's good. Which is, as she said, currently under review at University of Rochester Press, so very much keeping it in the family. And that book is titled Plastic Surgery on Paper, How Visual Culture Defined Second World War Reconstructive Surgery in Britain. This presentation will focus on one chapter of that book, so one part of that definition that I argue that the visual culture is working to provide. And it'll show how the work of a surgical photographer, and you can see one example of his photography here, as well as a small portrait of him, how his work helped to reinforce and proselytize the myths and reputation of British plastic surgery at home and abroad during the 1940s. I argue that these photographs thereby helped to visually define and categorize plastic surgery, as was the goal of these surgeons in this period, categorize it as innovative and as a particularly British practice. And before I truly jump in, I just want to give you a heads up that, as you might expect from the title, I will be showing some photographs of surgery, before and after images, and many of these are facial wounds and reconstruction. So just to give you a heads up. Between October 1941 and January 1942, the British surgical photographer Percy Hennell accompanied the plastic surgeon Harold Delph Gillies on a lecture tour of the Americas. Their stops were wide-ranging, from Chicago to Houston to New York City, from Lima, Santiago, Buenos Aires, and Sao Paulo to Montreal and Toronto. On this tour, American newspapers, and you can see a few examples of them in the center here, their mastheads. These American newspapers termed Gillies as the bald, benevolent, world-famous father of modern plastic surgery. They wrote about how he lectured on the unique advances of British surgery, while Hennell showcased his pioneering British color photography that documented those advances. On this lecture tour, both Gillies and Hennell were actively supplying evidence for Gillies's paternalistic father title, which is one that historians of medicine are almost always wary of when it's applied uncritically to individual figures throughout medical history. These newspapers highlighted the role of color photographs as well as a color film in Gillies's presentations in the United States. After a series of color photographs of patients were shown, one newspaper said that, quote, in a Technicolor talking movie, the victims later proudly exhibited their new faces, arms, and bodies. This film mentioned was presumably plastic surgery in wartime, which was a government-sponsored piece of propaganda that was narrated by Gillies and produced by the Realist Film Unit earlier in 1941. The government had also sponsored at least part of Gillies's international tour, on which he had flown 27,000 miles, given 36 lectures, and made an uncounted number of speeches, and performed 16 operations. And that was the government's wording there. I argue that even though not directly funded by the British government, Hennell's photographs also earn this propagandistic label that's applied to this lecture tour itself and to the film just described, both then and now. Lecture tours like this by British plastic surgery's illustrious figures were meant to advertise to other countries, both visually and orally, the standout nature of individual surgeons and of British plastic and reconstructive surgery as a whole. Gillies had already done a lecture tour during the First World War and made a later trip to Boston. These visits left him in no doubt of his status as a significant, famous figure on the international surgical scene. In 1948, Archibald McIndoe, a plastic surgeon who came to prominence in Britain during the Second World War, also carried out a lecture tour in the United States and Canada that was covered extensively in the press. Gillies's 1940 tour with Hennell would not have only publicized British surgery, but the international showings of Hennell's color photographs may have helped to bolster the reputation of British photography as well, which was lagging behind innovations in both Germany and the United States at the time. So showing British photographers pioneering the use of color photography, and I'll get more to whether it's actually pioneering at the end of the talk, and showing British surgeons pioneering the reconstruction of faces, Gillies's tour with Hennell reflects anxieties about British scientific progress in multiple fields, both surgery and photography, also reflecting how the reputation of British plastic surgery was intertwined with the reputation of its visual culture. This plastics and photographic proselytizing was beneficial for Britain on an international scale, and these tours fit into the parameters of British propaganda abroad during the war years. Historian Susan Brewer has outlined how British propaganda in the United States worked at the intersection of foreign relations with American politics and culture. This cultural propaganda was present not only in art and films, as is made obvious by the term cultural, right? But it more broadly had the purpose of promoting national aims and touting national achievements, such as those in science, in a way that was more general rather than specifically economic or political in form, which is what we usually think of when we think of propaganda, right? So the explicit purpose of Gillies's and Hennell's presentations during their 1941 to 42 lecture tour was to promote British achievements in surgery and in clinical photography, but it had the additional purpose of bolstering the status of Britain at war at a time when initially the United States was still teetering between neutrality and entering the conflict. So British plastic surgery, as it was framed by British plastic surgeons, was the indisputably world-leading center of the field. Photography helped to push that message. As British scientific advancements were, photography was also an important vehicle to convey British narratives of global influence from the 19th century onwards. Historian Jennifer Tucker has argued that photography helped to visualize the cultural and scientific superiority of British, particularly English, society in the Victorian period. Victorians saw both science and photography demonstrating superiority of British civilization on the world stage. While the British Empire was in its decline in the mid-20th century, the practice and messages of plastic surgery photography of this period continue to be tied up in this colonialist visual history of scientific exceptionalism. As it did in the Victorian period, in the 1940s, photography helped to define the parameters and extent of the British scientific innovation as it was understood both globally and at home. Gillies himself was a product of the British Imperial Project, as he was originally from New Zealand and willingly co-opted as the British father of plastic surgery. But he was also very much a perpetuator of the visually led narrative of British supremacy. Hennell's accompaniment of the eminent Gillies across the Americas evidences that images were a major component of the trip's directive. Even on his earlier lecture tour to America during the First World War, or after the First World War, Gillies traveled with 700 lantern slides in his luggage. Can you imagine traveling with that many little pieces of glass internationally? So it must have been really important to have these images with him in order to lug those across the ocean, right? So by 1941, Gillies had been a proponent of clinical photography in Britain for several decades, and that earned him the position of chairman of the Royal Photographic Society's medical group. So he's very intertwined with clinical photography. Gillies and Hennell had been collaborating since 1940, when Hennell began taking photographs in plastic surgery wards, including the ward in which Gillies was head surgeon. Prior to the war, Hennell was a manager for the color photographic department of the Metal Box Company, which is exactly what it sounds like. They made metal boxes. And it's there that he practiced advertising and documentary photography, largely taking photographs of metal boxes or containers that were made by the company. So during the war, around 1940, the Metal Box Company shifted from producing canning products to making wartime goods. So in this spirit, at the beginning of the war, the chairman of the Metal Box Company told Hennell that he should, quote, do something useful in a national sense with his photographs in surgical wards, with his color photography. And Hennell was then seconded to the Medical Research Council to take photographs in surgical wards, which Hennell and Gillies later showed in their lectures. So these photographs depicted patients at several key moments: when they arrived at the hospital with burns and facial injuries, in between the steps of surgeries, and when they were healing after or in between operations, because often there were many, many operations to have these faces reconstructed. Like the words spoken by Gillies on this lecture tour, these images put forward a particular message about the power of British surgeons and surgery. For example, this photograph on the right was taken by Percy Hennell of Gillies's hands. Used as the cover of Gillies's 1957 book, The Principles and Art of Plastic Surgery, but taken earlier, this photograph plays into many of the narratives that plastic surgeons wanted to put forth in this era. Almost above all, they wanted to show that their hands had special artistic powers, medical and artistic powers. We can see in this image how Gillies's gloved hands gingerly hold his tools, almost like an artist's. This image, like Hennell's photographs of other plastic surgeons' hands, infuses a godlike art genius power into the digits of these surgeons. The inflection point of the fingers on the surgical tools is imbued with a vibratory power in both of these photographs, bolstered by the glossy solid greens and blues of the photographic image. These photographs turn these surgeons' hands into pieces of art as well as into the hands of the artist. So both of those are happening at the same time. The comparison between the hands of the surgeon and the hands of the artist would not have been lost on surgical audiences, but there was much discussion of the supposed similarities between these two in medical journals and in presentations and speeches by plastic surgeons. And this comparison would likely have been brought up by Gillies on this lecture tour because he loved talking about this, and he loved talking about the fact that many plastic surgeons were also amateur artists. And this is something that's impossible to forget when you're doing this kind of research, because the archive in London, where much of this is held, has Gillies's landscape paintings hung on every single wall. So you're literally surrounded by this plastic surgeon's art when you're trying to research the art of plastic surgery. So it's this type of myth-building message, which is obvious in images like these, that I also read into Hennell's wider surgical work, so his documentation of patients and their progress. The aesthetic and compositional tools of Hennell's photographs, evident in his photographs of the hands of Gillies and others, also proved useful for writers and publishers outside of the medical realm, who were advertising what I argue are similarly propagandistic nationalist narratives. By looking at Hennell's non-surgical works, we can start to see through lines in his other surgical photographs, allowing for an even stronger argument for a propagandistic photographic style. By looking at how his images advertise British nationalisms that inadvertently reveal wartime and post-war anxieties around the destruction of histories, society, and landscape, my research links Hennell's three major photographic projects of the 1940s. His surgical photography, which I've already talked about, his illustrations for J.B. Priestley's propagandistic book, British Women Go to War from 1943, and his images for Geoffrey Grigson and John Piper's nostalgic book, An English Farmhouse and Its Neighborhood from 1948. Grouping these three seemingly disparate projects together clarifies the nationalist purpose of Hennell's surgical imagery, which defined reconstructive plastic surgery as distinctly British. Now, Hennell's color in particular is a key component of the nationalisms espoused by his photographs. In An English Farmhouse, the author Grigson wrote that he and his photographer collaborator Hennell, quote, believe that color photography can be revealing without being chromatically hideous. Grigson's statement may have been a veiled allusion to Technicolor, which was seen by much of the mid-century British population to be garish and too saturated, and therefore distinctly American, because garish equals American. A 1951 publication called Color Cinematography stated that a study of the British public's attitude towards color in film revealed that there was, quote, a marked antipathy to excessive use of vivid color, apparently popular in Hollywood, which may be due to a national liking for the restrained and rather sad tones typical of the British sentiment for color during the last 100 years. Film historian Sarah Street has suggested that nationalist ideas and stereotypes may have led into the perception of Technicolor as being brasher than it actually was because it was associated with America. Playing on long established ideas of national difference, British color was perceived as more tasteful. Hennell and his collaborators on An English Farmhouse had the common goal of making color photography subtler and more appealing, and therefore perhaps more distinctly British. It's interesting then that the Technicolor film Plastic Surgery in Wartime was shown on Gillies' lecture tour. It's likely that the British Council, which funded the film, recognized the national and emotional qualities of color in film and used Technicolor in this instance to appeal more to American audiences. British propagandists looking to target American audiences were careful in studying American opinion and choosing methods of dissemination. They studied American beliefs and attitudes in order to identify themselves with the same values or to take care not to tread on them. So it seems that the audience for the Technicolor film Plastic Surgery in Wartime was American, and therefore this type of color could have been used to remain familiar and engaging to American audiences. While Hennell's more British color, or what they saw as more British color, was used both in Britain and on the lecture tour, so it had multiple uses. Reading Hennell's color photography in his commercial book projects in the 1940s, alongside his surgical photographs, changes the way that we can think about his medical work, its purposes, and its techniques. Like these two publications with their more overt messaging goals, Hennell's surgical photographs were invested in advertising British progress and in defining plastic surgery as particularly British. Hennell's 49 color photographs in J.B. Priestley's British Women Go to War had a very specific, invigorating message to advertise. That women in Britain, more so than in any other nation, were doing their patriotic duty by working, and that they were fulfilling these duties on the home front and abroad with alacrity and panache, and as you can see here, a lot of style as well. Priestley stated in his first sentence that, quote, "No country engaged in this war has mobilized its women for the war effort more thoroughly and efficiently than Britain has." So very strong thesis statement from the very beginning. The morale boosting purpose of this book is visually furthered by Hennell's patriotic inclusion of reds and blues in hospital blankets, skies, and colorful steel bars in factories. British Women Go to War was designed and produced by Ad Print Limited London, specialists in publishing commercial color photography, as evidenced by their name, Ad Prints. So Hennell shot these images for Priestley around the same time that he was working in plastic surgery wards. In this medical capacity, he created many before and after photographs, often as part of a longer narrative series, that succinctly showed the reparative steps of British plastic surgeons' medical miracles. In the hospitals, Hennell primarily took close-up bust portraits of people wounded in the face, but injuries on limbs and torsos also populate his wartime collection. These images guide the viewer through the surgical story of each patient, from the initial burn or wound to hopefully the healed visage or body part, months and many operations later. In a 1945 address to the Royal Photographic Society, Hennell stated that, quote, "From the medical point of view, it was important not to just see a series of photographs, but to see them side by side." So it's this temporal pairing of the before and after that Hennell himself advocated for that I'm really interested in here, particularly in its role in what I call surgical propaganda and its role in national myth-making. So Hennell's photographs from the surgical ward and those in Priestley's book crafted visual narratives to communicate or advertise similar messages of British resilience. The before and after pair, which was used historically in plastic surgery, and I've got an earlier example in the bottom right there, proved a particularly canny technique for conveying these messages. As in many of before and after pastel drawings of Gillies's facially wounded patients made by Henry Tonks during the First World War, that's bottom right, the narrative maintained by Hennell's surgical photography suggests that there was a clear and relatively easy path from injury to healing for these patients. Seeing that Gillies's artist from the First World War, Tonks, used the same temporal construction that Hennell would later use in the Second World War, suggests that the surgeon continued to see the value in this trope decades later. Part of that value is that the protracted time in between each step of the operation, or of each operation of itself, or the time that it would take to pose the patient, is elided in the singular moments that the camera or the artist could capture. Photography historians and theorists Kate Palmer Albers and Jordan Baer stated that the contrasts at the heart of before and after device are the, quote, visible and the unseen, the certainties of proof and the imagined processes of transformation. They also argued that the special power of this photographic trope comes from how the photographs relate both to one another and, most intriguingly, to a third, generally unseen event, the thing that happens in the middle of the before and the after. Both in medicine and in morale, so both in his surgical images and in British Women Go to War, Hennell's photography acted as proof of the transformative nature of British industriousness and progress. Plate 7 and plate 8 in British Women Go to War depict the same woman, as you can see in the captions here, both before the war and now, so 1943. In the before image, the woman was a housemaid at a doctor's in a small country town in Somerset. At the right, she's become a member of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, or the Army's women's branch. The woman looks down in the staged maid photograph, apparently focusing on a task below her to her right, but out of our view. The action of the woman at war, however, is full of upward momentum, her tools of the trade readily appraisable by the viewer. At the left, the satiny, formal maid's attire puckers and shines at each curve of her body, highlighting the outfit's impracticality and superficiality, especially when it's compared to the matte, rough cadet green of the Army uniform. The frilly femininity of the maid's cap has been swapped for a hard helmet that suggests the visual imaginaries of martial values. The clothes are a major part of the visual messaging here. As in the women at war images, and as in Tonks's before and after portraits from the First World War, seen at the right here, another example, the sartorial status of the figure in Hennell's photographs is important for the narrative being conveyed. And that's in his surgical photographs as well. So there are examples in Hennell's surgical images of injured patients in their pajamas, which you can see at the right, the top here, or at the left, sorry, the top here. Apparently having been woken up by aerial bombardment, having sustained burns and injuries, and taken directly to the hospital. Here, and this is made clear in this image, the full image, and in more images of this patient, this gentleman on the left by Hennell was wearing his orange striped pajamas and threw his brown cardigan on over them when he was awoken by the blast. Yet this really starkly contrasts with photographs after surgery, in which men like this one sport suits and ties, which you can see in the bottom photograph here. The pajama photos show these injured individuals in more vulnerable states, while suits and ties align them with traditional masculine roles associated with wage labor, suggesting that they can easily reintegrate into society now that the plastic surgeon has successfully reconstructed their face. In his text about plate 7 and plate 8, Priestley reflected on how this young woman, like some of her peers, may want to get back to pre-war life after the conflict was over. But he states that this may be impossible. Quote, "These years in uniform will have changed her." In Hennell's imagery of surgery from the last slide and of propaganda here, the clothing used in the before and after images work to make this narrative clear. This type of double page before and after spread is used several other times throughout British Women Go to War. In the discussion of Mrs. C, shown here, the trope is deployed to exhibit that though they've adapted and changed dramatically, these women workers have not lost their connection to their familial duties. Like the plastic surgery photographs that Hennell displayed on Gillies' lecture tour, these images show a problem and its solution. Priestley described these two plates in this manner, stating that these photographs, quote, "present the problem on a heroic scale and seem to show how it has been solved on an equally heroic scale." During the day, in a before image dominated by grays and blacks, Mrs. C works for the railway, soldering and reglassing engine lamps. But the after photograph alleviates the worry that Mrs. C may have relinquished her womanhood for this dirty job. At the end of the day, Mrs. C returns to her family of 7 children, the youngest not pictured, in a cream-colored family room decorated with painted ceramic amphoras and black and white photographs. In this photograph, Hennell framed Mrs. C as a matriarch, with her smartly dressed children, a young red-headed girl in pink, 3 of the older boys in suits, and 1 in a military uniform, fanning around her in a supportive and attentive bubble as she points towards a newspaper. Echoing the caption visible on the newspaper, Priestley referenced the Stalingrad spirit of the heroic British working-class mother. As with Hennell's plastic surgery patients, Mrs. C's time-consuming act of transformation from worker to mother is not shown. Through the before and after trope, the viewer is comforted that the indomitable wartime spirit of British women has the power to convert them from worker to housewife and from maid and to military woman, depending on the country's needs. Similar visual tropes of miraculous female transformation can be seen in some of Hennell's surgical pairs. As the suits and ties of reconstructed men align them post-surgery to traditional masculine roles, sartorial details such as pearls and lipstick suggest a fashionable and modern femininity. The blue jumper, red lipstick, and pale skin in one of Hennell's surgical pairs once again puts forth the patriotic blue, red, and white that Hennell used throughout British Women Go to War. These two images show a much less graphic injury than many of those that Hennell depicted in the wards and theaters. But the visual change and the appeal to a regenerating and healing Britain is still succinct, clear, flattering, and impressive to the viewer. just like the changes magicked in British Women Go to War. In the second image, the patient's reconstructed forehead no longer catches shadows, the dark circles under her eyes have disappeared, and her hair is more neatly curled and arranged. As with several of the British Women Go to War images, here Hennell's use of color and the before and after convention conveys a forceful narrative about female potential and wartime transformation made possible by specifically British innovation. However, Priestley's final section in British Women Go to War, which was titled Glance at Tomorrow, challenges the status of these after images. Priestley asked in this last part of the text, what will be the effect of all this activity and all these changes on post-war Britain? Millions of women are doing jobs they never thought of doing before the war. What then will happen after the war? It was worth posing the question of what would happen after the war, because even though these photographs and Priestley's narrative made the changes look and seem certain and permanent, the future of women and work in Britain was still unknown. The seeming ease of Hennell's pairs belied the transience of wartime adaptations and anxieties about the longer-term impacts of these changes on British society. It would have been impossible for Priestley and Hennell to know that it was generally the case that women's working lives largely went back to pre-war patterns after 1945. Some women's moves away from working after the war were not only because of culture and politics, but also because the women workers themselves were passive and disinterested about their wartime jobs. And this is not the surface message of Hennell's before and after photographs. While overall, Hennell's images here feel optimistic with their bright colors and commercially minded in their staging, there's a temporal complication within this publication that muddles the seemingly simple narrative of the before and after trope. As Chris Belden Adams described in her nuancing of this photographic construct, these image pairs refer not only to the temporal experiences of the past, but also to the future, present, subjective, and compounded tense experiences, among many possibilities. Hennell's advertisements of British female adaptability, paired with Priestley's writing, unwittingly invited this pondering on potential future timelines. Likewise, Hennell's before and after work from Britain's plastic surgery wards both reinforced and contradicted a seemingly straightforward account intended to show British exceptionalism and innovation. The surgical photographs were meant to exhibit the miraculous and almost unbelievably talented hand of the surgeon. But taking facially injured patients as subjects complicated this desired neat narrative. Because of the colored prominence of scars and red or pink healing patches of skin, the story of outright British medical might is complicated in the mind of the viewer of these surgical photographs. The varied hues within Hennell's photographs, because they're shot in color, and examples beyond the two images of the woman patient that I've already shown you on the left here, they show the inconsistent aesthetics of the healing process. These images, particularly the final healed photographs of the patient, which is what you're seeing on the right here, were supposed to show British surgeons' finished products. But because of the complicated and traumatic vicissitudes of injury and healing, before and after images are necessarily reductive, and there's often no single before or conclusive after for these patients. The uncompromising detail of Hennell's color photographs show that these patients, even though healed in the minds of the surgeons in the hospital and photographers, they'd be perceivably, even if subtly, different from their peers. Their scars, both physical and psychological, could prevent them from reintegrating seamlessly into civilian life. So Priestley, in his concluding writing in British Women Go to War, throws doubt onto the staying power of the after images by Hennell. But Hennell's color in his own photographs does this in the surgical realm. These entangled visual narratives represent insidious anxieties about wartime change. What kind of society would exist after the war? What kind of scars would the conflict leave, both literal and metaphorical, on British people individually and as a whole? These complications allow the viewer to go beyond the positivist wartime message of the simple past and simple after. Surgeons would have wanted to convey the tidy simplicity of Hennell's image constructions, particularly in propagandistic international lectures. They used color photography, perhaps mistakenly, to advertise this message. Looking at Hennell's non-surgical photographs in tandem with his medical imagery helps us to understand the complex story of national progress and healing that he and his collaborators were trying to convey. So it was Hennell's experience of color photography as a nationalistic and documentary tool for, 1, the metal box company before the war, 2, for plastic surgeons, and 3, for British Women Go to War. It was all of that experience that made him an ideal photographer for an English farmhouse and its neighborhood, edited by the artist John Piper and written by Geoffrey Grigson. Hennell's close crops and colorful attention to detail again subtly encapsulated the wartime and post-war concerns around rebuilding amid the disastrous effects of decay or destruction of war or modernity, which are messages also implicit in Hennell's surgical and overtly propagandistic works. An English farmhouse contained 30 color photographs by Hennell, taking an elegiac approach to cultural nationalism. Here, there's a focus on vernacular architecture in the English countryside, with a lamentation of disused or abandoned rural buildings being replaced by those that are, quote, not natives, of native conception and native material. This book emphasizes the importance of history and tradition. To strengthen the perceived distinction of the old farmhouse and English farmsteads in this book, Grigson traced the modest history of a farm, which was meant to stand in for all similar farms, back to 6th century Saxon predecessors. So very much hitting home the narrative that this is native. Both the author Grigson and the editor Piper, whose artwork is shown here, were associated with the Neo-Romantics, which was a group of British artists and writers from this period who looked back to the art of the 19th century in response to the threats of the mid-20th century. Hennell's photographs communicated the messages that were agreed upon by the 3 of these men in their collaborative projects. They were all working together. An element of the neo-romantic agenda of the 1940s, which is what's captured photographically in an English farmhouse, was a symbolic conservation of Britain. Piper's own artwork was very much in this nostalgic and nationalist conservation vein, with his representations of country houses and churches spurred on by the threat of the obliteration of the past from Nazi bombing, which you can see is represented here. Hennell's project with Grigson and Piper was, like his surgical work, involved in the profuse documentation of a domestic entity that required reconstruction and preservation. In this case, it was national heritage and culture rather than British faces and limbs. In the preface of one of his other books about the Romantic artist Samuel Palmer, Grigson ended with a plea that more care should be taken to preserve all the various documents which show how and why English artists lived and painted. A terrible destruction must have gone on in the last 100 years. The book An English Farmhouse served this documentary role of preserving cultural history. Documentation, history, and attention to the national flavor of their disciplines were important to both neo-romantics like Grigson and Piper and to 20th century British plastic surgeons like Gillies. And tellingly, both of these groups turned to Hennell to fulfill those goals. The plastic surgeon Brian Morgan ended a 2016 history of British plastic surgery with language similar to Grigson, with a plea to members of his field to, quote, think of the instrument you invented or the photograph at the bottom drawer of your desk and let the archive know. This was necessary because obituaries are rarely written and published now, so people who have contributed to the development of our specialty will be forgotten. As Hennell took the photographs of Gillies' hands to preserve a record of their power, so he was also tasked with photographically preserving the quiet power of the English farmhouse. Hennell's photography served the role of record keeping for these two seemingly very disparate groups, neo-romantics and plastic surgeons, both then and now, preserving particularly British histories against destruction and decay. Hennell's color photographs in An English Farmhouse developed this conservationist agenda by capturing the specifics of the farmhouse to make the dilapidated environs feel as if they were still softly pulsing with life, bringing vitality to ruins like those in Piper's neo-romantic paintings, which I showed on a previous slide. The lens of the camera became the tool for Grigson, Piper, and then the wider audience of the book to view and diagnose the structural or bodily ailments of the English farmhouse and countryside. One image is provocatively titled "The Dying Barn," but it's not quite dead yet. This book, illustrated by Hennell, dissects each element of the countryside neighborhood's body as if it's not quite yet a corpse, but it soon will be without our attention and without this strategic conservation. As Grigson stated in the preface of the book, the point of the publication was, quote, to discover how such buildings were made and to see the parts that make up the whole anatomy of the farmhouse and its neighborhood. He stated, one must bring one's eyes to the unfamiliar view until one sees the grain and the shape as well as the total. Here in an English farmhouse, Hennell reprised his role as medical photographer to document in color detail each fragment of the farm, while Grigson wrote the nostalgically poetic diagnosis of the reasons for the English farm's decline. Instead of focusing on a burnt face or a fractured arm, or a tin or a label of a canned product, as he would have at the metal box company, here Hennell homed in on the bricks, thatch, and wood beams. This was exactly the type of profuse documentation that was practiced in 20th century British surgical wards, where, according to the surgeons themselves, documentation had reached a fine art with photographers such as Hennell. Plate 20 of the book depicts the framework of a decayed barn still firm despite its lack of roof. This photograph is meant not only to display the strength of native materials and historic craftsmanship, but also to preserve with an image something that may not exist in a few years, despite all of this particularly English strength. The lush greens of the farm can be seen behind the skeletal remnants of this one relatively tiny corner of the farmstead. But the photograph's tight crop highlights the importance of the minute. Hennell's color photography grasps at the deeply creviced beams, pockmarked with knots and holes. His work documents the most seemingly insignificant details of the English farmstead, such as yellowed lichen and initials carved into wood. This is a type of nostalgic propaganda. Pairing with Grigson's text and Piper's vision, Hennell's photographs show Britons and others the heritage, history, and strength of England's countryside. As was the case with Gillies' lecture tour, the purpose of this publication was not only to show something uniquely British, but also, as the book jacket of an English farmhouse states, to, quote, produce outstanding examples of what the color camera can do. The color that Hennell used was lauded by the surgeons and authors with whom he worked. This was the particularly British color that had helped to propagandize the nation's medical might in the Americas, and it was the color that avoided being chromatically hideous, according to Grigson, allowing for a message about Britain's history and heritage to be preserved in a particularly British manner for British audiences. Viewing his surgical and his nostalgic images alongside his overtly nationalist photographs from British Women Go to War reveals the aesthetic threads and shared purposes throughout Hennell's 1940s work. But there's something about Hennell's color itself that adds to this concept of his photography as propaganda. Not from the 1940s, but today, in the myth that British plastic surgeons tell themselves. The processes that Hennell used were invented decades before he began photographing in the surgical wards of wartime Britain. And yet the Plastic Surgery Archive, where his works are held in London, has claimed in various forms since the 1980s that Hennell was a pioneering photographer who invented his own type of camera. Some writings affiliated with the archive even go so far as to claim that his method was the only type of color photography in this period, which is just definitively untrue. This claim that Hennell was a uniquely advanced photographer who created his own type of color photography and camera at a time when this was a rarity is a myth of the plastic surgery world that meant to craft a particular positive definition of the field. In their telling, British plastic surgeons snagged this innovative photography for themselves. By proximity, as was the case in the lecture tour that paired Hennell and Gillies, this photographic myth seems to bolster the innovative status of the field and its surgeons in this period. Hennell's photographic story in reality is not one of particularly trailblazing, fame-rendering innovation, although obviously I argue that he's still an important figure to study. Rather, his story is one of a commercial photographer who found himself amongst medical men, appreciated for his colorful photographic work that could be used to communicate the methods of mid-century British plastic surgery. The unique thing about him wasn't that he was unique in photographic history, just that his was the only instance of color photography being used explicitly for surgery at this time. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but that's actually for a really good reason, because a lot of people at this time are writing about how both photography and color were pretty much useless for documenting surgical progress and surgical images. So I argue that Hennell's photography, both his obviously nationalistic work in British Women Go to War and An English Farmhouse in Its Neighborhood, as well as his work on the surgical ward, is propaganda because of the visual techniques in common to all three of these groups of work, and because of the way that Hennell's work lives in the historical archive today. The definition of propaganda is the dissemination of information, so facts, arguments, rumors, half-truths, or lies, to influence public opinion. Percy Hennell's photographs were used to influence public international opinions about British plastic surgery during the Second World War. By looking at his other projects from the 1940s, we can see visual and historical parallels that help us to further bolster this argument. We can also see that his photographs are still used today by plastic surgeons to tell certain versions or half-truths of their history. Hennell's commercially minded color photography projects not only boosted British morale, but also communicated and advertised national messages about surgery, about Britain, and about British surgery. Hennell's projects with Priestley and with Gregson and Piper are not as far removed from what he was doing within the wartime plastics wards as it may first appear. Hennell's surgical images proselytized a soft propaganda of Britain's and British surgeons' medical achievements. In British Women Go to War, he propagandized the national spirit and strength of Britain's women. And in An English Farmhouse, this noble perseverance and the nostalgic need for preservation and documentation was applied to the country's farmsteads. In these projects, Hennell's photographs hinted at the anxieties about the impacts of war and modernization. Hennell was employed as a documentary photographer, one who could and should show what was there in front of him. And yet these photographs were also advertisements created by a trained commercial artist. Through analyzing these two book projects, we can more fully understand the political, advertorial, and defining purposes of Hennell's photography in the realm of Second World War plastic surgery, and how and why Hennell's prowess as a photographer continues to be framed as more than its reality in retellings of plastic surgery history in Britain today. This throws a sharp light onto the nationalistic goals of surgical photography, making it clear why Hennell's imagery was perfect for a propagandistic tour of the Americas. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much. That was fascinating. I'm going to open it up for questions. I will run the microphone, and I'll invite you to say your name and your affiliation if you would like to when you're asking your question, or use the microphone to just focus on anything here.
Hi, I'm Corey. I'm a med student. I'm wondering if there was kind of, for the patients who were kind of photographed before and after surgery, I'm wondering if there was kind of consent there and to what extent they knew their photographs were going to be shared. Did they know they were going to be shared internationally, or what did that kind of talk look like?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that. My next project is on the consent of these photographs and how like anonymity worked within them and when and how it was used. But basically the easy answer to that question is that it was very much assumed that if you were consenting to surgery, then you consented to to photographs of your surgery. The clinical photography was very much thought of as part of the surgical process, and they didn't really think about the lives of these photographs after the fact, as far as I can tell. So yeah, the consent wasn't there in terms of where and how it would be shown, but it was thought of consent to surgery equals consent to photography. It's just part of the operation.
Hi, Emily, from the University of Pennsylvania. Can you just elaborate a bit more on why people were skeptical about the value of photography, particularly color photography, in documenting the surgical process?
Yeah, so the problem with photography is that it's too real, basically. It's too detailed. In all of these surgical wards, there were also medical illustrators, and they were much more useful for the actual nitty-gritty documentation and teaching of these operations that were still very much in development. And so you've got surgeons writing, medical illustrators, of course, they're biased, writing, and other scholars writing about how photography really is nice, but it's really drawing pencil, pen, paper that will allow you to show very clearly, without the mess of blood and surgery, the steps of an operation and the actual before and after.
Was there merit to that argument? Was that a circular thing?
I think there's merit to the argument, having looked at a lot of these. A lot of the photographs, I mean, the ones that I've shown you here are fairly clean, but a lot of the photographs it's really difficult to parse what's happening. And, there'll be steps of the surgery, or it's hard to tell what part is belonging to what. Granted, I'm not trained in plastic surgery, but the drawings are much, much clearer.
Follow-up question to that, it's really interesting. So I see particularly two uses. The medical illustration may be useful for a trainee who needs to understand the process.
Yeah.
But this medium has an opportunity to teach what it might be like to engage in this work.
Mm-hmm.
Did they make that argument at all? I mean, there's the experience of working on a patient that is going to be more accurately depicted in photography.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, one interesting part of this is that in the drawings that I look at, they very rarely draw the after, because what's important in the drawings and for the teaching and for trainees is the process. Whereas photographs, because the after is cleaner and, can be used, as I argue, in kind of propaganda circles and for, showing how great these surgeons are, that's the use of photography that's really helpful, right? So they can occupy different spaces, but yeah, the medical illustrators got a bit huffy when photographers were also in their space in the operating theater. So it's like, that's not the most useful place to be for you, right?
Well, I'll insert myself. So is there a counter narrative what could have been? Because when you show us before and after and it's how it's propaganda, obviously she's so pretty in the second picture and not the first one. I'm like, yes, of course, that's what plastic surgeons do, having looked at, that, facelifts or breast augmentation. Yeah. I mean, it's almost, you go to a plastic surgeon website and it's their portfolio and is it a before and after?
Yes.
Were there competing visions of what this might look like? Because to me, it's like, okay, no, duh, of course, plastic surgeons have before and after, that's what plastic surgeons do. But you're saying, no, this is before and after, it's going to be complicated, it's propaganda. Was there another option that was laid to waste, or what was chosen from different ideas, or what would be the counter narrative to this? Of course, we must do before and after.
I think I understand your question. I think a counter narrative that we can read into it is almost what I said earlier with the drawings. Like, there is no after, right? It's just the process, and then patients are off on their own without having to know what they looked like, right? And yes, you're totally right that before and after trope is still very much alive and well in plastic surgery, and that's very much a trope that has been used since like the mid 19th century. Not sure I answered your question.
That's maybe a follow-up to that question. And just more on like the background of medical photography at the time, like, what was happening in America? How was medical photography being used in other specialties, and how was what was happening with plastic surgeons kind of more nationalistic than that per se, especially thinking about America?
Yeah, that's a good question. As far as I know, the surgical photography in America was in black and white, which is again why they were kind of showing off Hennell as like, look, we've got color photography. Isn't this amazing? Isn't this so artistic and special? And maybe you should join us in the war because we've got this. I mean, obviously not quite that strong of an argument, but like it's adding to this appeal of British surgical prowess. At this point, there was kind of an uptick in the professionalization of medical photography. So a lot of departments in America and in the UK were starting to hire, actually more after the war, but in the 30s as well, starting to hire departmental photographers for the hospital and to have photographic departments within the hospital. So Hennell was a little bit different in that he was employed somewhere else and was then hired to travel around to different hospitals and kind of like spread his skill amongst a lot of different plastic surgeons. And I'm not sure that in the States there was anyone working in that kind of diffuse way, but I haven't looked at photography in the States as much. Hopefully next project.
This is in regards to, you mentioned, the British women go to war, how they're talking about how they're like, oh, the British women are the most mobilized of any of them. And then you also quoted someone saying that they had like Stalingrad like resistance. Which I thought was kind of ironic, but also made me think, was there like any follow-up to this, especially with regards to how the Soviet Union reacted after World War II, or what did this catch on at all?
That is a great question that I honestly do not know the answer to. Yeah, I don't know, but I also think that image with the Stalingrad spirit is really fascinating. You know, showing the current events that are happening on the newspaper as she's pointing to it. Not only that she's working during the day, has her family at night, but she's also keeping up with what's happening and very much involved in like what's happening in the war. But I don't know the answer to your question, unfortunately. Thank you for asking, though.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, and my question might not surprise you.
Okay.
So you talk about propaganda, right? And this is somebody who is using their talents and skills for a purpose. They have an agenda. And I guess my question is who doesn't?
Very, very good point. No, that's absolutely true. I think that in historians of medical photography, and there's been a bit of a shift recently, but tend to look at medical photography in terms of like its aesthetics and the questions of consent that were raised earlier, and kind of like the emotional valences of them, which is also something that I'm really interested in as an art historian. But I think this question of funding, of purpose, of, you know, how it's intertwined with government and, you know, nationalist agendas is something that hasn't really been explored within medical photography histories. So that's why, I mean, yes, you're right. Everybody has an agenda, and all artists have an agenda. It's just that it hasn't really been explored as much in medical photography because the idea is, oh, the agenda is to show the clinical operation, right? It's to show what's happening in medicine, whereas I'm arguing it's more than that as well. But yeah, you're totally right.
I just have a factual question. So presumably these were people who were wounded at war, but also perhaps who were wounded from bombs.
Mostly home front, the ones that I'm showing.
So
not this gentleman, but
children photographed as well.
Some. But interestingly, and this is something I want to look into more, children are much more populated in the drawings than the photographs. I don't know if that has something to do with getting them to sit still. It might just be as simple as that. But it also might be a question of, you know, consent and autonomy. I'm not quite sure there. But a lot of photographs, or a lot of children appear in the drawings by the illustrators who are working in the same hospitals as Hennell. And very few photographs of children by Hennell. Yeah, really interesting. Thanks for bringing that up.
I'm not sure if you already touched on it, so I was able to have, but looking at like the pictures of like before and after, and like talking about timing, do we see like, are there any trends of photographing more like people of color at the time or things like that to see what the economy?
Really good question. Absolutely none in British women go to war. They are all white women. Yeah, that's that publication who it was trying to frame as Britain, right? However, of course, you know, the people who were injured and who came to the hospitals were much more diverse. But I'm not sure that I know there weren't not nearly as many photographs of people of color as white British people, but it'd be interesting to see a full list of what was shown on the lecture tour and to match that with the patients that are depicted in these photographs to see if they chose to show a certain demographic of British people when they traveled, or if not, I have an inkling as to what the answer would be if I were able to do that, but unfortunately I don't have a list of the photographs that they took on the lecture tour. That's a great question. Thank you.
Ted Brown, hope you can say something about the actual sites of the lecture tour. What venues was the site presented, and tie that back into the question of the relative status of American versus British reconstructive surgery, not photography of the surgery, but the surgery itself.
Oh, great question. And I have known this. I'm going to try to see if I can remember, but it's written about in a lot of the newspapers where they did these lectures. I believe one was at a dental surgery conference. So conferences, some were at hospitals, because some Gillies would do a surgery and then do a lecture. Some were in, yeah, and some were also in more public spaces. So like center town halls and things like that. So from the sense that I get and from what I can remember, I haven't looked at that in a while, but from what I can remember from reading the newspapers, they were in various different sites. So yeah, part of the purpose was also to show how these British plastic surgeons, who very much were framing themselves as, you know, the vanguard of the field, how they could train American surgeons to become reconstructive plastic surgeons as well. And a lot of Americans did go train with Gillies both during and after the war, First World War and Second World War. So, you know, I've got plenty of drawings and photographs that have American surgeons who I've identified as American surgeons who came back to see Gillies after his lecture tour to train in his operating theater. Thanks for that question.
Percy, I have a question. You talked about the difference between an image and the photographs, and you said as an a visual historian and an art historian, but for you the photographs were less clear and difficult to interpret, and that reassured me because the first photograph that I saw of the woman with the head injury.
Yeah.
It may be where I'm sitting, but the coloration and the clarity on her left side, it's very hard for me to see her the definition of her face. So if you have difficulty with the photographs and the clarity of what is being seen, that's interesting to me because I have this memory that when photography was first presented, it was supposed to be clearer than the human eye, that it was supposed to be infinitely more detailed, and yet this color photography and the way you presented it is a very different story.
Absolutely. It was framed as the most scientific type of art or image making because it was real. It was what was in front of you. There was no hand of the artist to muddy the waters. When in reality, and a lot of what I argue is that that's actually flipped. Lots of times the hand of the artist, because of their trained judgment and ability to interpret and simplify, you get that much more scientific clarity versus photography is not as useful on that front. So yeah, that idea of like scientific objectivity that photography was supposed to promise in the 19th century is just didn't come to fruition, at least in this area. Mhm.
I also think it's true that photography can be manipulated.
Absolutely.
And for example, if you look at the black and white photograph,
Mhm.
that obviously has been manipulated in printing it. And the same, I think, can be said of color photographs.
Yes. And just as an anecdotal evidence to that, one of Gillies's 1920 book, which was published mostly with his First World War patients, he says at the beginning, and that's all black and white photographs, 1920 book, says at the beginning, photography is great because, there's no artist, nothing has been changed. I think he said something like Sidney Walbridge, which is the photographer, had to subvert his art in the name of science, right? So just photographing. And yet some of the images will say, we removed a little smudge on this patient's chin because it was distracting. And so it's like very clear that they're touching up the images, but at the beginning of the book, they say, no, but these are photographs, like this is real, this is really how it looks. And yet they're constantly subverting that message in their practice, in their photographic practice. So yeah, very good point.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask if was he using commercially available film or was it really his own process?
It was not his own process.
Wasn't made.
I have, he did use Kodak. He did use Kodak. He did use Kodak film. I have tried so hard to find what these surgeons and these archivists are referring to as this newly invented thing that Hennell did. I promise that trying to figure out how exactly early color photography works mechanically is actually harder than trying to figure out how early plastic surgery works mechanically. It is so complicated. I spent hours and hours and days and weeks on this, and he was using everything, maybe in slightly different combinations but he was using everything that already existed that was being practiced by documentary photographers, art photographers as early as 1906. So his methods, some of them were way outdated even. Yeah, so there's.
One last question.
We can chat later.
It makes me appreciate that sparks my curiosity about other patents on these methods, right? Like, is that a way to try to discover?
I haven't, yeah, and I looked at patents, of course, to see if Hennell had filed any, nothing. And the funny thing is, you've got all of these texts by surgeons saying, oh, Hennell invented this yellow filter that, really helped the color and blah, blah, blah. And, they're really, and, he was the only one doing this type of color photography, or the only one doing color photography in 1940, which is not true. And I have quite a few speeches and writings from Hennell. Never once does he mention, oh yes, and the thing that I invented. He's always like, oh, and I used this camera from this company. I used this film. This is how I developed, but never, and this is something that I came up with myself, which you'd think if he was doing a speech to the Royal Photographic Society, he would talk about his own inventions. So I'm pretty positive that it's just not there.
Wonderful. Thank you for such a fascinating talk. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you to Sue Leighton and the Rochester Academy of Medicine. We are the Corner Society. We meet here once a month. We're going to be back on March 6th. We have a really special lecture. We're hosting Marco Ramos, who is a practicing psychiatrist and a historian of medicine and psychiatry. He's at Yale at the School of Medicine and History of Medicine. He's giving a talk which was co-sponsoring his visit with the psych department. It's called Woke Science, Psychoanalysis and Revolutionary Awakening in Cold War in Argentina. It promises to be a fascinating talk. He's also giving psych grand rounds the same day at noon, which will also be a historical topic, and that's called The History of Psychiatry as Harm Reduction. And I think both talks could be interesting to many who are in the room. So I hope you join us for that. Please join me in thanking Professor Steve Logan for a wonderful talk. And there's going to be a wine and cheese reception in the room behind us. So please continue conversation. Thanks, David. You're- I will touch it. Thank you. That's pretty.